welcome again after the break. We've got the last talk today by Ramesh Srinivasan. Ramesh is a professor at UCLA, the Information Studies and Design Media Arts Department since 2005, and is also an author of a book, one of the books, because there are more, but the last one is Beyond the Valley, how innovators around the world are overcoming inequalities and shaping the technology of tomorrow. But also a book, Whose Global Village, Rethinking How Technology Impacts Our Worlds and After the Internet, with Adam Fish. And also I can see, Ramesh, that you were studying engineering at Stanford, and so probably you know some people from who also used to study there, who are now yeah, exactly. And also at MIT Media Laboratory and Harvard University. And because your talk would be about some alternatives and also some proposals from different places around the world that could not only activate our imagination, but there are some serious proposals and serious alternatives to the system that we were criticizing today, and I'm super interested in this moment of hope that I'm expecting from your talk. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, everybody. I've been waiting to give this talk because it's the first time I've given it, and I want to thank Bartek, the entire team, Pavel, everybody, Eva, Marta, Joanna, Magda. I feel like I know everybody. We were in touch over 1.5 years ago, I believe, and we made it happen. And somehow I made it here without a bag, but I'm here. And I, more importantly, want to thank you all for supporting refugees, and to talk about how, in my mind, that's a sort of sacred duty we have as human beings. And it also reminds me of the larger question, which is kind of connected to this talk, which is really about who gets to move in the world. Who gets to move? So Ukrainians, fortunately, there is some movement. But what about the Yemenis? What about the Somalis? Right? What about people plagued by civil wars or other forms of oppression right now that are occurring? And so there is a racialized aspect to migration and mobility. And I think as we think about technology, we need to think about these vectors of power and movement and mobility accordingly. So we actually see, and a few of you have made this excellent point today, about the restriction of circulation of movement, right? And this is something that I really want to touch on. Borders, biometric borders, algorithmic borders, physical borders on the Mediterranean where people from sub-Saharan Africa are dying. Our brutal, inhumane border in the southern part of the United States, where people from Central America are actually, the border is being extended all the way down to Chiapas, where I've done field work in southern Mexico, and where Zapatismo comes from. And you see the border being extended all the way thousands of miles south of the United States' actual so-called physical geographical border. So in many ways, this talk is not sort of focused solely on technology, because I think the pandemic forced a lot of us to dream and imagine and reflect and sort of embody and feel things. And I think I'm at the point in my career, in my life, where feeling and spirit and affect in a non-academic sense drives my practice. And I think that's always where I've been, but now I'm willing to just go for it and talk about that. So what I want to do is first start with examples where I feel borders have been annihilated, and just kind of speak to those as sort of metaphorical or conceptual visions of what can be and what is and what we should fight for. Fight for possibly from a place of love as well. So some of you guys know this, 11 years ago, I was based in Tahrir Square in Egypt in the middle of the Arab Spring, just a couple months after it initially broke out. I have a lot of friends who work in human rights, a lot of friends who are journalists, And they invited me over there to demystify this narrative that it's a social media revolution, that our technologies, our being Silicon Valley technologies, where I'm actually from, I'm South Asian, but I was born in Silicon Valley and went to Stanford, our technologies saved them, a neo-missionary liberatory discourse. So it's easy to trash that narrative for any of us in the crowd. I've heard plenty of positions that are responsive to that. But the more interesting question is about people's agency and their concepts and the ways in which people kind of quote unquote innovate. We got to take that word back, innovate. Innovate with constraints, be resourceful, hustle, subvert. And those were the things I was looking at in the Arab Spring, how a very small minority of the population, who was pretty demographically homogenous, were able to subvert technologies of all kinds to actually help shape a social movement while working with labor, while working with the Ikhwan or the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, they were problematic, but they were part of this coalition. So we saw borders, constructs of bordering essentially being eroded and these false fragmentations being taken over and dismissed and discarded in the Arab Spring. So if any of you want to talk to me about that, I spent 3 summers there. I used to write for Al Jazeera and do a lot of media for them. That's something we can think about here. So I'm going to dance around and kind of hopefully keep your attention all the way through. I try not to use too wordy slides. Now I want to introduce examples from animist pre-colonial systems of knowledge, being, and knowing, ontological systems. This is an example of the Dogon community, but there are many, many communities that have what one might think of as pre-colonial kinds of practices. And in those practices, concepts of bordering, fragmentations that start with the Enlightenment, with Linnaeus, who was a racist, right? Who came up with the term Homo sapien, is a racist book, okay? Everyone should know that. These constructs of discrete divisions between the knower and the known don't exist in these communities. And we see this all around the world. I've worked with indigenous communities in the United States. I've worked with communities in India, in Latin America, all around the world. There is no border. What do I mean by that? That doesn't mean people are not distinct from one another. Everything is governed by relations, not constructs of fragmentation. So the Dogon community don't see a distinction necessarily between a single human being and other human beings, nor do they between animals, plants, and other beings. They're all different in ways, but they're not disconnected. They're not discretely disconnected. They also see their ancestors as living in the here and now, and they also have a relationship to non-human entities that might be even physical, like constructs, like rocks, stones, sticks, but even machines that they create. So this is a new kind of animistic ethos that I think is very important. And instead of it being just a random example that I'm providing to kind of remind us of other ways of knowing and being, this is actually quite common, these practices, in many parts of the world, not just in the African continent, but relevantly in the African continent, which represents the fastest growing population in the world, the youngest population in the world, and the population that's most rapidly intersecting with digital technologies. So let's reanimate our thinking about technology accordingly. Okay. Now you're going to hear a little about me and my personal life. So I'm a practicing Buddhist, and every morning I pray for the well-being of all other beings. It's something we call bodhicitta. And I was a devotee of a man named Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently passed away. Some of you might have known him. He was a close friend of Martin Luther King. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King. And he was a Vietnamese activist who fought against the war, and which is very rare for monks to get involved, similar to what happened and is happening in Myanmar right now. And he got exiled and started a community in Plum Village, which is a very progressive, social justice-oriented community, which is all about decolonization, including decolonizing our hearts and our minds and our spirits. And one of the concepts that there's deep metaphysics that come out of Buddhist practice. I think many of you know that. And one of those concepts that Thich Nhat Hanh talked a lot about is the idea of what's called interbeing. We have a myth and a vision that we are all kind of discrete individuals, right? And that actually is sort of how we think of ourselves as fairly self-contained. But my attitude, my spirit, what I say, how I look is going to affect you all, and vice versa. We are extremely relational beings, yet we have constructs that are all built upon the myth of disconnection and the myth of fragmentation. So what Thai always said, Thai is Vietnamese for teacher, is there is no lotus without the mud. the mud is the lotus. So we would actually chant to the mud sometimes in our practices. So now let me give you another example related to the Yolngu people of the Northern Territory of Australia, or what's also called North Arnhem Land. This is a concept that relates to what are called song lines. Some of you might have heard about that. Bruce Chatwin wrote a really good book about the song lines. That's a Western person writing about, but it's actually a really beautiful book. But the song lines are demarcations of time and space. And they're related to this concept called karma. And karma is the meeting of people, places, and times. They all have to intersect with one another. So for example, in Karma practice, Aboriginal peoples, it's actually kind of terrible to call them Aboriginal, Yolngu peoples for many years have practiced what is called, in the Western sciences, people call it prescribed burning, right? So you actually do these burns, and in a way that's kind of cultivating relationships to the land. And that's extremely important to have careful burning amidst our climate crisis of certain types of burning so that the land can regenerate and it grows. But it's not a scientific taxonomy by which they practice this. It's ritual, performed, embodied practice. They harvest clams. It's kind of amazing. They eat yams, and I don't know why those two things rhyme, and they walk the land. They sing the land. So you have to put your body in space with certain families, times, and practices to actually engage in the burning itself. And all these Western scientists are trying to learn from these communities in Australia, which has terrible, terrible fire problems, just like we do in California. But what they want to do is abstract, quantify, extract. Right? We've talked about these political and power relationships today, rather than embody or learn in a more open manner. A transmission of knowledge that is embodied and situated rather than an abstraction. Okay. So these are just some initial thoughts that I want to share with you all, just to kind of blow our mind open. And I'll give you one last one. So this is in Borneo. I don't know if any of you have been to Borneo, in Kalimantan, and I had a chance to go there. It was like really, really amazing. But it's also a practice you see in Chiapas, in the southern part of Mexico, which is like where I go a lot. It's really amazing there. These are sort of the hangings of umbilical cords. I know that might be gross to some of you, from trees. It signifies that the bodies of people are not distinct from the trees. They're all integrated. This is done in a performative way when people are born. And we've seen this with Quilombo communities also in Brazil. So this is a practice, again, so many communities in the world have an embodied, if not sacred, relationship to non-human nature. And those sorts of practices, I think, are extremely important because look where we're at right now. The age and era of mass quantification, right? There's all this kind of crap saying Facebook knows you better than you know yourself. What does Facebook actually know? It knows various traces and footprints of behavior, right? Quantified traces have become the representation of life. And they have fed back into systems that are designed to overwhelm and essentially annihilate our abilities to cognitively process, let alone meditate or reflect or take it slow or chill, that actually end up making us products of such quantified systems. So there's an ontological distinction here, right? When ontology here, I mean ways of knowing, ways of mapping, ways of creating, ways of being. And that ontological distinction is all about the distinction between data as the certain kind of surrogate for life itself, and all of these kinds of practices I'm speaking about. And there's quite a bit of discussion of conscious and sentient AI, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but that's all based upon the idea of quantified abstractions of life itself, right? Of activity itself, right? So I wonder if my feelings or my irrationality can be mapped or quantified. I wonder if my ways of being, which are based on complex interactions between time, space, body, and other entities, and my memories, and so on, can be quantified. These are nothing but representations, which is why I asked the question earlier, to the great talk earlier, about representation that's occurring here. So what we have is representation and reduction, which obfuscates as humanness and human practice, right? And this is the violence. This is the violence of where we've gone with technology. As a former former engineer. As a Stanford graduate, I have, I don't know if you call them friends, people I went to college with who are like bazillionaires, including Trump's former ambassador to Sweden, who doesn't speak a word of Swedish, by the way. Typical. So this is kind of where we're going. And this all happened because of exponential transformations technically in the cost of computing, processing, the cost of storage, and the Trojan horse, which is like our phones. And the fact that anything we do these days increasingly is being quantified and represented, right? Whether we are going to a hospital and not even having a phone, there's quantification occurring. So we need to recognize that mediating every human interaction, every aspect of life is an attempt to abstract and represent in a way that serves purposes of speculative capital, which I'm going to speak about in a minute. So where have we gone right now? The wealthiest companies in the history of the world, we are at a privatization of public life, a privatization of the commons, insofar as we believe in a commons. I always believed in kind of the Nancy Fraser concept of the public sphere, which is a multiplicitous public sphere. We can speak about that as well. But basically, so-called tech companies are no longer tech companies. The wealthiest company in the history of the world, biggest taxi company in the history of the world is Uber. The biggest hotel company in the history of the world is Airbnb. The biggest media company in the history of the world is Facebook, right? And the whole goal is to spend nothing, hire almost nobody, own almost nothing, and monetize everything, right? All for investor capital, which we people in America at least call it publicly invested companies. There's nothing public about it. It's about an oligopoly of power. So this is extremely important because independent contractors are the appendages to these systems, right? Like commercial content moderators, call center workers, or Uber drivers or whatever, TaskRabbit delivery people. But they are all also being extracted and essentially exploited for their data to replace them with privately owned machines. And we see that happening with Amazon fulfillment centers right now. So this is very important amidst an economy where, Jaron Lanier likes to give this example. Some of you might know him, my colleague, where Instagram was sold in 2013 with 13 employees for $1 billion 3 months after Kodak. I'm not saying Kodak's like the best company ever, but Kodak had about 40 to 50,000 employees and hundreds of patents, went bankrupt. 40 to 50,000 people lose their jobs, 13 people make $1 billion. And by the way, Instagram's worth hundreds of billions of dollars right now. So it was a good investment by Facebook, right? The idea really is such to this massive transference of wealth where I've had some conversations over the past few years with Yanis Varoufakis. Some of you may know the former Greek minister. Well, he's in MP in Parliament, I believe, in the EU, but he calls it techno-feudalism. So if you all think about it in a certain way, what we're paying is rent, right? No longer is ownership really part of this situation right now. So that's why over the past couple of years, and likely moving into the future with climate-related issues, heaven forbid, future pandemics and so on, we are technologically dependent. And the point was made earlier that public funds and public life has been farmed out, including by Andrew Cuomo, the former disgraced governor of New York, to private corporations. It was like handing the keys to the digital future to Eric Schmidt and other kind of folks like that. So this is why we're seeing an astonishing amount of wealth transformation to a feudal level. Right? 3 people with equivalent wealth in the United States to 185 million people. 3 people, 185 million. These were Bernie Sanders lines, I'm just copying them. 8 people in the world with equivalent wealth to 4 billion people. Okay, so this is what we're talking about, and the vast majority of those folks are connected to monetization of this kind of quantification that I've been speaking about. And the thing is, it's kind of a Ponzi scheme. It's kind of a house of cards, because Uber, for example, until very recently, had never turned a profit. Never turned a profit, yet worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Think about how stock market valuation and profitability are no longer positively correlated, right? Why is that? Because of the power over network effects, or the power over people's data, and the fact that Uber has essentially overtaken the market, right? You can think about Google search, for example, as a type of public utility. 98 to 99% of searches done in the world, I think that might even include China, are Google searches, right? So essentially they have captivated and taken over billions of people's lives, and that's what billions of people turn to. So the idea of a competition, even like a kind of DIY competition to these platforms is very difficult to imagine. Nonetheless, there's a great deal of discussion about little things here and there, like deplatforming the former fascist, possibly soon to be fascist, our former, I don't even call him president, but that monster, right? I mean, honestly. I mean, I was losing my, I won't cuss, but it really shook us up, especially for me as a person of color, like experiencing all the things that we experience. And I was on Democracy Now! With Chris Hedges, who I respect a lot, discussing this deplatforming. And we both were for not deplatforming the president, but the fact is he was a central node, and here's the key, on Twitter. He was a central node. All the hateful crap he was putting out all the time was designed to disorient people. It's straight Riefenstahl. Right? So it's like you kind of look at the content and then you ask the question, why is everyone always viewing his content? Why is all of his content algorithmically being suggested to us all? Because the new raw materials of digital capitalism are not just the exploitation of labor and nature, it's also our emotions and our anxieties. Those are the new raw materials of digital capitalism, right? Because affect, command of attention, people are being suggested content that makes them grabs their attention, right? Because and a lot of this is neurochemical. It's dopamine, it's adrenaline, and it's cortisol. These three hormones are a very important part of this story. So, there was a lot of discussion about Trump. That helped me kind of push my agendas, which are like a progressive transformation of all things technological. But I also, it's very worth noting that also Twitter had deplatformed worker organizing movements, including my friends from More Perfect Union, had a video describing Amazon workers attempting to unionize. Thankfully, that's now starting to happen, and that's successful, but that was also deplatformed. That content wasn't put up either. We all know the story also of WikiLeaks and how WikiLeaks was deplatformed, no matter what you think of it. I have strong thoughts about it in a positive sense, but deplatformed off of Twitter as well. So really what the question is why are we focusing on the little choices that they make as private corporations that are attempting to govern our lives, rather than the larger question of should they be governing our lives? Should they be quantifying our lives in a way that's ontologically violent toward how we are ultimately, I believe, as living beings? So one of the things I did in New York right before I came here is I was riding a bike. It's really fun to ride a bike in New York, by the way. I was riding a bike with one of my friends who's like an artist and punk all over New York, taking pictures of Apple billboards. And you may see that. I don't have a very good phone, so it's like not so clear. But can you all see that? It says, privacy, that's iPhone. Do you notice that there's the phone is being placed right above, in front of the person's face? That's very telling. That's Apple basically sneering at people and saying, hey, you can trust us with your privacy because we have your thumbprints and your retinal scans, right? When we talk about Apple, we're talking about the wealthiest company in the world, the most highly valuated company in the world, one that violates biometric notions of privacy, monetizes their app store in a very similar way to the way Amazon monetizes everything that's on there, extracts labor and raw materials from displaced locations, and engages in planned obsolescence, which is the idea that they design their phones to die, which is very similar to how Monsanto bioengineers their seeds. So this is all related to necropolitics, not just biopolitics. Necropolitics, which is Achille Mbembe's fantastic work on this subject. So you're hearing a lot of Achille in my talk because he's influenced me a lot. I'm on my way to Africa during my sabbatical to hopefully be schooled by him. So there's a lot of discussion in the kind of diversity, equity, inclusion space about what's called algorithmic bias, right? And a lot of that I found kind of interesting. It's like, we need more fair data. We need more data from black and brown people so our systems are more accurate. All the while not ignoring the fact that actually the ways in which black peoples in our country have always been massacred and violated has been through surveillance practices. I mean, if you look at the history of the Black Panthers and the role of COINTELPRO, J. Edgar Hoover's practice on that, you actually see that surveillance and capture of people's data is far from fair, it's a violation. So there's a lot of discussion of how these biases occur, but the point really being from these articles, and I do appreciate this article by ProPublica, that black folk all the time by these algorithmic systems are seen and deemed as more violent, and there's a criminalization of those who are already marginalized. And think about that. Peoples who were enslaved, their descendants are criminalized. That's a psychic trauma, in my opinion. Okay, so more on all of this whenever you want to talk to me about it. There's a lot of discussion also about how various types of algorithmic systems and what we call semi-automated systems are being used to actually take over people's work, right? So like guys like the World Economic Forum talk about the future of work. I like to talk about the future of workers. And I think it's really important to think about how, as we are kind of framed as users, our other identities are actually being annihilated, right? Like us as workers, us as citizens, us as complex beings, and so on. And so some of those systems that are out there, you might know, use algorithms, for example, to replace human resources workers, to scan people's CVs and look for whether those CVs should make the cut from, say, 150 applications to the final 5. And we've seen biases around gender, queerness, all of these, disability, reinforce themselves again and again and again. And part of the reason why is because those biases and inequities exist in our world. So it's actually this idea of what the world is what technologies are not just disrupting and amplifying in a negative sense, but are actually working with. And so that's why we've seen with these systems, The Guardian did good reporting on this, that science and technology jobs again and again and again by these algorithmic systems were being presented to men over women, right? Because we know there's that bias exists, that it exists, that women are not as good at these fields. And that's been proven to not be true by psychological researchers. So what we're really seeing here is kind of these different themes that are occurring based on the privatization of public life, right? Private interests dominating all, and the kind of violence of the neoliberal model, which was kind of our best choice, you know, in this last election in the United States. The Biden model, which is like kind of do nothing and say America's great, or fascism, right? That was our choice. So we chose Biden. I voted for Biden, but it wasn't really who I worked for or voted for before in the primary. But this is actually a huge issue because this so-called disinformation topic, or conspiratorial and hateful content, has tended to go viral across different platforms, not just on YouTube, not just on Google News, not just on Facebook/Instagram, but across platforms by what we call a media ecology, how these things inform one another. And I think it's really important to make the point that all of it is based on correlation, not semantics. Tell me if any of you want to talk about that more later. It's all based on existing patterns that are being gleaned and replicated into these systems. Yet we start to think about these systems as somehow intelligent, when nothing they're doing is but learning from our patterns and optimizing for whatever corporate outcome that these folks choose. So, you know, there are these spectacular failures that get attention. They help people like myself push agendas. I work with a number of people in Congress and people, you know, in other parts of the world as well, like politicians and so on. You know, it's kind of exhausting, but at the same time, what we're looking at is how so one of those spectacular failures was the example of Cambridge Analytica, right? They were using psychographic models to attempt to sort of map data and what data is being suggested to someone based on the idea that, for example, Joanna, I have all this data about you, but I also am able to figure out what your complex psychology is. Like, you're smiling, you're nice to me, we barely know one another, but maybe tomorrow with your son or your daughter or your husband or your parents, you're grumpy, right? And this is based on models like the ocean model. And so this is all why this data science thing has become such a big deal, because the idea is I can map each person here to some sort of complex psychographic quantification, right? And I can gather data about them to figure out their psychological state at any given time, and then I can feed them content based on what will psychologically influence them. And this is really related to the history of marketing and advertising and propaganda itself. No less than Aldous Huxley talked about this 50, 60 years ago, in, related to Brave New World also, but it's also something that we've really seen again and again and again. For example, Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, was the father of quantification and propaganda, which became the marketing and advertising industry. But now it's gone gonzo. That model has taken over everyone's lives, targeted the idea of all of us as targets. It's all violence in some way. That's why we've got to get back to who we actually are. Okay, so some of you knew about this when this occurred, GPT-3, the so-called open source Google platform. The open source thing is a big smoke screen. I can talk to you all about it. It's a way of harvesting free labor, and then these companies make decisions whatever they want to do, right? But this really freaked people out. It freaked out some of my friends. For example, you probably heard about this story just like last week that occurred with the so-called sentient AI. But this again is all based on correlation. This is all based on correlation. These AI systems are powerful in a sense because they're some sort of shallow representation of human behavior and action and activity, but they aren't humans, and we should never blame engineers at Google for their wanting love and wanting affection and wanting connection. We have stuffed animals, right? And this is, I never want to do that. We all saw the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix. It's a similar example to that. But what we do need to know is this is not any sort of representation of human or human life. That's not that. It's some sort of Black Mirror kind of correlation, kind of mapping, which is suggestively kind of appealing to us all because we're all increasingly alienated in our societies. Emil Durkheim wrote about this hundreds of years ago. So all of this kind of gets back to what I think is another important border, which is space. I think space is a border, and particularly the privatization of space. You may be curious why Jeff Bezos, right, the founder and CEO of Amazon, the second wealthiest person in the world to Elon Musk, is so invested in space. In fact, he said he's going to give all of his earnings to his for-profit space company. What's that all about? Well, we can remember certain stories like Whitey on the Moon, right? We can also look at examples like Tribe Called Quest. I told some of you I was a hip-hop DJ earlier. They had a great song on their last album, like Rest in Peace Fife, called The Space Program. Look at the lyrics there. I write about it in my book. And it's about who gets to leave. It's kind of like Dr. Strangelove, if any of you know that reference, right? So it's really this idea of space as departure and the certain kind of fatalism and a lack of faith in our beautiful planet, in one another, in the beauty of being alive. I really think it comes down to that has now penetrated the technological imaginary. And a lot of cyberpunk writers, Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, people like that have said, we didn't intend for these novels we wrote to become like gospel dogma for these folks. And I'm not even interested in abusing anybody or just kind of going after these people as individuals, but recognizing that we've been hijacked ideologically by a bunch of myths that now many of these folks who are the wealthiest and most powerful people, in a sense, in the history of the world are buying into. We even see it with the annoying as F identity politics discussion, right? That's a construct that's being created by the media and by social media companies to manipulate those of us who are on the left or those of us who are in solidarity with deeper movements and that deeper sense of oneness that comes out of multiplicity. Right? And so there are people like woke academics, well, they're not woke, anti-woke academics like John McWhorter or the Jordan Peterson, whose name I probably shouldn't have even mentioned, who try to basically capitalize on all of this without any training, any reason to do it. And what we do need with identity is recognize the pain and suffering that many people of different identities, women, queer people, black peoples, indigenous peoples have suffered, so we can all kind of embrace a different kind of emergent oneness, right, that comes out of that recognition. But instead, this is where things have gone. So in my book, I'm going to argue many of these ideas are constructs that are built upon manipulating people's attention and manipulating our minds to think of ourselves as broken, when in many ways, the vast majority of people in the United States, believe it or not, who are manipulated by our media and capitalism and around the world, don't actually believe these things that actually are being fed to us. I really, truly believe that. Maybe I'm just hopeful of that. So what I want to do is kind of move to different examples from around the world. And I already started with some of them, but I want to go back to that after like the trauma 20 minutes that I just did. And I want to show you the example of my friend Osvaldo, and I also want to show you the example of the Detroit Community Technology Project. I think I'm going to show these two at the end of the talk, depending on how much time I have. How am I doing? I think I'm going pretty fast, right?
You're the last one, so
cool.
we can extend it.
I promise not to go too long. I have so much to say. I'm speaking quickly because it's like there's so many things to say. So I want to let's go to it. All right, let's watch like 5 minutes of this. This is an effort called Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria, and I'm gonna just explain it. Indigenous communities across the Oaxacan rainforest, in the cloud forest. I've been working with them for like 5-6 years, writing about what they're doing, supporting them in whatever ways I can, building stuff sometimes with them as a former engineer, and they are building their own cell phone networks. And it's not even about the cell phone as something liberatory, but it's the idea that if we take control over our infrastructures of all kinds, we can then redirect them to support our own interests based on political philosophies people have of comunalidad, tequio, autonomía. I can explain these things. Autonomy, collectivity. This is the idea that in many parts of the world, people believe in doing work for the greater good. They really do. Like, I've worked in many countries, and I see that all the time. And I think that that's really important to recognize related to this effort. And this is happening in places that have been ravaged by colonialism, or examples like our own version of that in the United States, like Detroit, right? Where we see a renewal of urban farming, we see a renewal of community-driven governance of all things technological or otherwise. And in the process, we see a decentralizing of digital literacy skills, employment skills, and so on. And really the most important thing is the idea of redirecting these networks and designs to support something that's collective and place-based. And I think the way we kind of engage in a counter-hegemony of all of these issues of power is to think about these examples on a rhizomatic level, what they mean coming together and what the lines of flight are from them. One amazing initiative, which are children of Zapatistas that I've gone and visited in Chiapas, is called Ictacop. So that's in Celtal, which is one of many Mayan languages, and it means words in the wind. And these are basically kids in Chiapas who are like 18, 19 years old, who are actually building and wiring, again, their own intranet networks, as well as using it to support, and we'll see this when we can get the sound working, to actually support radio, community radio. And that's very important to remember as a technology today. I have seen that all around the world, a lot in South America. Communities that don't have written language, their languages were banned from being written by colonizers, have actually been using oral media, like radio, to actually support their own traditions, but also to organize, right? So I've been in Bolivia, for example, where I've seen Aymara feminists and women building their own radio station, repairing it, like really cheap, and actually using the radio station to organize textiles, to organize political movements, and so on. So that model of thinking about a collective oral technology that's governed locally as a model for thinking about networks and digital networks of all kinds is really interesting. And I think it's something we can think a lot about here. Give other examples, then I hope we can get the sounds working after that, Joanna. So we have a lot of other models. My friend Nathan Schneider, who is like an early occupier, is one of the lead people, and some of you might know Nathan. He's great in what we call the platform cooperativism movement. So we have a lot of ways to think about the governance of these platforms. Like, what if the workers at Uber, I know Uber doesn't care about its workers because it's trying to obsolete them out, but what if the workers at Uber owned that business? Can you imagine that? Or what if we all kind of owned Facebook on some level? Or what if the whole public had a universal basic dividend, not income? I've talked to Andrew Yang about this a bunch and argued with him about it. Dividend, where 10% of all, or that's what Yanis Varoufakis told me, 10% of all these companies that were using public invested resources. Remember, the infrastructure of the internet started in 1969 at UCLA, where I work. We paid for it. American taxpayers paid for that. So anything that lives on top of that should have a debt paid back to the public, just like all those Amazon vehicles driving on our roads all the time, right? But they abuse and manipulate our infrastructure and don't pay any taxes. Think about that. What a game, huh? What a move. So this is a whole other model that we can think about. There's lots of economic proposals out there, but I want ones that shift the governance back to people and planet. We also, so I wrote a piece for The Guardian. I've been kind of using this term. It's very American vernacular. That's why I call it that. Digital Bill of Rights. When my book came out, I've been doing a ton of media, and it's really, I'm super grateful to get to push these agendas everywhere I can. And what I'm arguing is we need and this is more on the regulatory side, we need an intersecting set of economic, privacy-oriented, surveillance-oriented proposals that we can all use to kind of recognize that all of these challenges that I'm speaking about are intersectional. They're both about privacy, they're both about public life, they're both about economic life, they're about political life, they're about, all of it is about recognizing that economically just societies are highly interconnected to a demos, right, to a democracy. And that's really important. We should not think about economic welfare outside of a true pluralistic, multi-racial, multi-generation, multi-ethnic, etc., multi-gender democracy. They're all connected to one another. So I told some of you this, I worked for Bernie on his campaign. That was like the closest I've seen in my life in the United States to someone who actually gave a damn about people. Trust me, he does, and he's really grumpy. But I got to meet AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Cornel West, who are like both heroes of mine, especially Cornel West. And we all got to talk about these ideas. And this was a policy I helped work on with some people in the campaign, which was part of what we called the Green New Deal. It was the idea that we need and he's a social democrat. I mean, he's not even left-wing at all compared to what we know of. But the idea was really returning investment to people and planet, right? Like investing in infrastructure. So in this proposal, what we tried to do is incentivize small businesses, cooperatives, indigenous communities to actually take over the reins of building businesses of all kinds and nonprofits, cooperatives, around anything digital, and figure out ways to redirect the resources of investment so it won't be this idiotic thing like all New York funding going to Eric Schmidt or Bill Gates, but it going to actually to people who are most suffering and most left in an unequal state in the context of all things technological. Another extremely important example is about the rights to repair. You may not believe this, but in the United States, we're not allowed to repair our obsolete technologies. I already mentioned how Apple phones have a planned obsolescence to them. But in places like Kenya, and you actually see this all around the world, people just hack things, they repair things, you just reassemble things. So I've seen, for example, this is in Kibera in Kenya, what people call jua kali. So jua kali means hot sun, and basically all it is, it's like people have a table, they have a soldering gun, and they're just mashing stuff up. They're just mashing things up. They're taking parts out of old cathode ray tube TVs and kind of reassembling them with parts like accelerometers from iPhones. And you see everything being repaired. And if any of you want to come meet me, I'll be in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in about a month, spending a lot of time in this incredible market that's called Mercato. It's like your mind is blown, seeing everything imaginable, old technologies, metal, tires, everything. Tables, wood, everything, and the key point is it's not just being repaired, it's being reassembled. And therefore, this is a new logic. This is what my colleague Stephen Jackson calls broken world thinking. Broken world thinking. It's a broken world, but people are showing us the way. Why? Because they have no other choice. Because they gotta hustle. It's all scarcity. And people in Kenya, they talk about it as what they call their side hustle. It's hilarious. I know people who have 40-hour jobs that they make more just printing t-shirts and selling them on the side than their 40-hour jobs. So that idea of contract labor is not part of the global south. It's kind of what they're attempting to do by trapping people into biometric systems is to basically control their lives in a disciplinary way. But actually the reality is, and you see it in India, for example, where my family's from, my God, it's just like people are just hustling all the time. And there's something wonderful about that chaos, right? Because it defies these systems of control and Foucauldian disciplining. Okay, so this is an example of the videos that I was going to share. We'll do that at the end. This is related. Vice did some coverage on what's been going on in Detroit. But we see these DIY networks emerging all around the world. I can talk to you about that too. In South Africa, Argentina, there's one in Catalonia called GuifiNet. And this is cool because it's a really interesting meeting between hackers and activists and community organizers, right? So it's like, these are the kinds of coalitions we need to change things. We need to change things with people who know community, know power, but also people who know how to kind of dismantle existing technologies and reassemble them. Okay, so I'm going to end with this, which is really, I think the really important point that my colleague Achille Bembe has been making is a sort of very optimistic, I would say almost a new utopia. Huh? That's why I put the word in the title. I'm very interested in taking those terms of power and taking them back, right? There's a reason why I have that annoying word innovator in the subtitle of my book. I'm really asking questions of like, what is innovation? Right? And we may even want to ask the question of what a utopia is. And can we move towards something that's more planetary? So that's what Achille is arguing. Achille is saying, hey, there are new ways of living and being and moving and relating that have always been part of our planetary cultures. And what we actually need is a way to have those kind of practices be part of our deeper consciousness. And he argues, and you see this right now in Africa, you can travel between 25 countries right now on the African continent without a visa. Not maybe us, but Africans can. How about that, huh? And in a sense, borders are not meant to restrict circulation. They're about supporting and mediating relationships. Huh? So I think that that's a very interesting point. The point of a border is to be crossed. It's not to restrict circulation, but it's about kind of managing circulation in a particular way, or feeling a sense of equity and communication in circulation. So what Achille is arguing, and I think this is critical amidst these existential threats we now face of climate crises, you know, capitalism gone gonzo, I don't even think it's capitalism any longer, is a new kind of planetary vision. And you know what, like, I'm going to keep it real and let's kind of go there. And so the question really is how do we arrive there, and how can these litany of examples I've tried to show you today really help inspire us to get there? And so that's my practice and that's my mission as a publicly engaged scholar and a journalist, and most importantly, someone who's dedicated to change and transformation. So thank you very much, and let's watch 2 of these videos, all right?
tantas cosas tan complejas, es por necesidad. Lo que a nosotros nos interesa es el servicio, ¿sí? Aquí con un poquito de dinero que nos dejen en paz, que no nos vengan a tocar, podemos vivir tranquilamente. Entonces, pues viendo las ideas de la parte intelectual, todo lo que estamos haciendo, sí va contra el esquema de arriba, contra nosotros.
Lo que significa el proyecto, yo creo que sí puede representar un peligro porque permite romper unos mitos y al decir, ¿sabes qué? Si podemos hacer eso y lo estamos haciendo en contextos establecidos económicamente, eso yo creo que es es algo poderoso, yo creo que es algo como que representa un peligro en cuanto a la conciencia que puede traer.
Ya vamos a hacer 3 años desde que iniciamos. Y bueno, en el proceso de estos 3 años han pasado un montón de cosas, ¿no? Yo creo que hemos pues superado varios obstáculos, hemos pasado varias vicisitudes, por supuesto, porque ha sido como todo un reto en algo que nunca había existido, ¿no? Pues a mí me gustaría que este proyecto fuera, sí, como tal cual como está funcionando ahora, pero a lo mejor también dando estos pasos que la tecnología te obliga, ¿no? Porque nosotros somos una comunidad que está afortunadamente llena de muchos jóvenes todavía, a diferencia de otras comunidades de la sierra, y los jóvenes pues te piden, ¿no? Te exigen, quieren estar en contacto, quieren estar comunicados, ¿no? Y por supuesto hay mucha gente que está en otras partes del país y del mundo, entonces pues ahora ya quieren estar en contacto a través de las redes sociales.
Yo siento como que la tecnología quiere homogeneizar el mundo, de alguna manera, ¿no? Y lo que tenemos que hacer o no dejar pasar es eso. Tenemos que, desde cómo somos, quiénes somos, y todos somos distintos, desde nuestros contextos, apropiarnos de la tecnología.
Que se adapte la tecnología a nuestras costumbres. No nosotros adaptamos a la tecnología, entonces nos rebasa.
So when they're talking about technology, what they're talking about are the ideologies and models around it. So what's amazing is there are many people from the Oaxaca region. This is in southern Mexico. It's so magical there, that are in the Los Angeles area. And so they're using these DIY cell phone networks not only to call one another across their communities. There's 64 communities. Some are quite far from one another in the Sierras. I mean, this is crazy cloud forest region, that are able to call one another on their own networks for free. So it's creating, and that's really important because some people work on terrazas, which is like very steep, planting canela, cinnamon, and café, y maíz, coffee and corn, and they need to contact one another that way. They're also, and this is a classic thing that's been discussed with technology, are able to sell and advertise their to people directly without being ripped off. And what's really cool is I've been in the Los Angeles area, in the Central Valley, where many people from Chiapas and Oaxaca live, and I've been on both sides of the phone call, So you can be on both sides of the call while they're calling family, many who are undocumented in the United States. And that, I think, is a very beautiful alternative kind of trajectory or architecture of thinking about networks and communication that's very powerful, emerging out of this collectivist, politically oppositional discourse. And I want to just show you one last one, which is from Detroit. This is super cool.
El conocimiento que vamos a ir generando.
If I can figure out how to do this. Okay, so just, oh, it's gone. I'll just show this to you for 3 minutes, okay? And then we can be done. No. There we go. Awesome. Just a few minutes. Think about how different these stories are, but how similar and connected they are.
Is quite sad. 40% has no connection.
So from food, housing, clothing, shelter, all the skills have been stripped from us. It's like, damn, I gotta build everything from the fucking floor up.
Digital justice looks like no chains, you know? It looks like giving the internet to people. It looks like building networks. That's how I'm doing it.
Maybe.
think that's a big part of the narrative too, is that people are just trying to keep their resources because so much is changing.
I'm Diana Sarah. Yep. Sounds a little low to me, aka Mother Cyborg. I've been teaching people technology for as long as I can remember. To me, Mother Cyborg is someone who's supposed to help people come to the realization of the potential of technology. I'm the director of the Detroit Community Technology Project, which is responsible for the Equitable Internet Initiative. Detroit's like one of the top 5 least connected cities in the United States. So what happens when you have half of the city that has 1,000 megabits per second, and then the people with the least resources only have 10? I think that causes a huge problem as far as what you can do with access. Because of high foreclosure rates, and because of bad credit, a lot of telecom companies don't offer good service within these areas, or they won't even turn on their fibers. So we have a lot of dark fiber that doesn't have internet running through it throughout the city. So we have gigabit fiber that we've purchased from a ring that was recently built downtown. They have built fiber up to a rooftop, and that rooftop then has a router that then is being pointed to each of our community centers. There's a global infrastructure. A lot of that fiber runs underneath cities and under the floors of oceans. That internet infrastructure then has these exchange points throughout the world. And the exchange points are where internet service providers then tap in to be able to exchange information. And then from there, internet service providers then build infrastructure to then share the signal. And so that's where we come in. We need to build our own infrastructure and rethink internet service providing and access in order to reach those people that have been traditionally left out and marginalized. So the work we've been doing is not just about access, it's about building a healthy digital ecosystem. We're also building an infrastructure that was missing in Detroit. What evolved out of that was what we call the Digital Stewards Program. We have now trained trainers in 3 neighborhoods in the North End.
So yeah, we just in our spot right here. Our AP's on top of this building. We got our drivers right here. We got that right there. We got the young guy right here in the North End.
And Island View.
This space, this is a major space for the church. Share network is down here. You can see over your computers. Light works on the wiring and cabling. There are a lot of those things that are on the tech side.
And then Southwest Detroit.
This would be an example of a public space. Some of the neighbors come over and they do their homework in the alley because we can share the Wi-Fi. A lot of the people right now, they currently there's people that go to McDonald's for Wi-Fi. Why not have public space for music?
It's at 18 megabits though, so 89. Usually we have to put stuff up on the roof, but these trees are old in the North End. That's been our biggest complication. These beautiful ass trees. It's good to have trees as your complication.
All right, I feel like we should have a conversation for whatever time we have left. I'm going to send both these videos out to the curation team, and I'd love for you all to check this out. There are more examples like this than you can imagine. So I just wanted to share two with you right there. So thank you all. Thank you. That was fun.
Thank you, Ramesh, for your brilliant talk, and for many people. So
sorry to keep you all up.
Thank you. Maybe you will be first. I wanted to. Okay, it's my fault. I wanted to ask you, because one of the works that we are showing within the exhibition It's called Fragile Connections, and it's about SNet, la red SNet, the network SNet in Cuba, in Havana. I don't know if you had the chance to maybe see it for a moment. But it's like very linked with these examples that you've been showing. However, this network recently was overtaken by the government and started to be official. And also it's controlled by the government, which has got like extra context in the Cuban situation. But I was also like wondering, when you were talking about this, especially this Central America and South America examples, like if there is a risk as well in, you know, in this like great examples of an alternatives, but also like in the like authoritarian political situation, if there is a risk as well that these ideas and creation of those communities can be overtaken by, you know, like corporations again linked with governments.
Yeah, I mean, North Korea, for example, has a large intranet, right? People don't really know about that. North Korea does. So I think there's always, right, the vision we have is one of a truly rhizomatic vision, right? It's sort of like the old Chomskyan vision of, and don't quote me on this too widely, of Anarcho-Syndicalism, right? That's kind of like, I interviewed Chomsky for this book and talked to him about this for a while, these ideas. He was like, why does technology matter? Why does any of this matter? I was like, because of power in these ways. Very intimidating to be interviewed by Chomsky. But basically, the idea really here is power, that the recovery of power in the hands of the commons, in the hands of people, commons being all our multiplicity of subcultures that are part of a greater commons, right? That is a fragile sort of, that's always fragile, right? And there are always going to be systems that are going to attempt to co-opt those things. And we've seen that rhizomatica, that effort that I showed you from Oaxaca is called rhizomatica, after rhizome. And true to a rhizome, in a way, they have been building with people, quilombos in Brazil, in Nicaragua, with communities in West Papua, right? Like just like part of Indonesia. So it's just been a really kind of distributed, decentralized process. But there's fragility always to it, right? It can be co-opted by state power, right? When we think about Deleuze and Guattari about states and war machines. But it's also can be co-opted by kind of companies that can create sexier, cheaper, smoother, slicker interfaces and use models like Facebook did to hijack you. And that's exactly what's happened with these guys in Oaxaca. Movistar, which is a Spanish company based in Madrid, and Telcel, which is a company run by Carlos Slim, who's one of, I think, the 10 or 20 wealthiest people in the world, made his money in gas, right? Those companies are realizing, oh my gosh, these guys are able to do this in this whole new kind of architecture, in this grassroots, reproducible, rhizomatic way. So what are they doing? They're coming in there with slicker technology and charging the same amount as, or less than these folks do. And instead of having to do this open source thing of typing 15 numbers, that's what you have to do to kind of get the number in, they do it in like the normal number because they've actually controlled the spectrum as well. So one of the arguments my friends in Oaxaca make is spectrum is also a question of rights. Spectrum is a type of territory. And I think that's a really important point to make. So there's fragility to it all. But I think the point really is that these communities are the owners of these networks. And so the question is when we think about ownership and equity and power over governance and design, how does that manifest in terms of value rather than some academic like me being like, that's awesome? How does it actually manifest in people's lives in ways that materially matter to them? I don't mean money, but materially matter to them. And that's the question that I think is extremely important, that these amazing activists like Osvaldo and Peter and others have to really take into account. And that's something I've seen from my friends all around the world that they're having to deal with, right? You got to figure out a way to maintain the value rather than just being an idealistic kind of frame. It can't just merely be that. It needs to produce that in people's lives. Many people are so disenfranchised, they're just looking for what's cheap and easy, and I don't blame them. you know? So that's an uphill battle when you're against marketing power, right? So there was a lot of street level propaganda and posters that Movistar, and I tell this story in Beyond the Valley, they were throwing them in there just to sort of try to manipulate people's minds. And it worked in some cases, but it's rhizomatic. There are other communities joining in, and it's really pretty amazing what they're doing. Yes?
Okay, I have the microphone and with it the power to ask questions. Can I disagree with you, but politely? Okay, so you spend half of your presentation with deconstructing the narrative, which is mostly neoliberal or post liquid modernism, and of the big corporations narrative. But I feel that you proposed a different narrative,
Sure.
which I subscribe to, and axiologically I agree with. But I feel that it was still a narrative with rhetorics, and I am somewhat afraid that is it scalable? Can we extend this utopia, which is somewhat realized right now with the communities, but it is abstract in a way, and I'm asking this question because I am afraid how we can realize this on a big scale, and just aside from it being a narrative,
Yeah, you're so right. I mean, there's no argument there. I completely agree with you. I mean, I'm trying to retake, and it's all narratives at the end of the day on some level, right? But when we talk about movimientos sociales, right, like social movements, it's always a tough slog. I mean, we saw what happened with the Arab Spring, right? I mean, I was there in 2013 when the military were dropping Egyptian flags on protesters and everyone was cheering the military, who were the exact people everybody was trying to get rid of in 2011. So these are like tough battles, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like there's a lot of models by which change occur, right? It can occur through movements that may not be scalable in a top-down sense, but kind of reconstituted in various places. But at the same time, we got frozen out of Occupy, literally in many cases. It was too cold. I'm sure there were occupiers here. It was too cold. You know, I mean, in Zuccotti Park, it was like too cold. So it's like the real issue is the coalescence of movements around particular sort of forms of power that don't have to be institutionalized per se, but need to be secure enough to protect the sovereignty that's achieved in the movement, right? And I think that's a huge challenge. So there's always like ambivalences with this, right? They're by definition, they are pretty specific and place-based. I tried to go scalable with my like hippie metaphysics part of the early part of the talk, right? I mean, just being honest, right? Like, but I won't say it like that, but like, those are to me more fundamental questions, but but in terms of implementations and movements, they tend to be pretty place-based. So then the question is how do those place-based movements interrupt and challenge systems of power or carve out third spaces, right? Otro mundo es posible is what Subcomandante Marcos used to say. So like, how does that create another world, right? And so the question for me could be partly about being left alone, as Osvaldo said. You're never truly left alone in this entangled world, but like some idea of governance and power. That could be one model. The other model could be to push, state power or corporate power. Those are other models we can do. There's also the wonky regulatory possibility, so for me, I work on every level because I care about trying to return power, right? And so I don't really think any of these are like any sort of golden goose, but I do think that all of them are important. And I tend to be fairly agnostic about, I'll try to do anything. I mean, I've worked with neoliberal Democrats for Section 230 reforms. Do I like those Democrats? No. But I'm gonna work with them any way I can. If I can use my mind to kind of help them with policy around whatever, trying to just avoid Trump, okay, fine. We'll take the fruit where we can get it, because it's all hands on deck. But I don't want to be alarmist about it either. I need that kind of utopian vision to be able to push forward. Otherwise, what are we going to do? I mean, what are we going to do? Like, so that's the way I look at it. So, I mean, it's a great question, and it may not be about skill as much as kind of movement of different kinds of models, and it might be a different kind of approach that we get. But I hope for change, you know, and I do see examples, which is why I asked the question earlier about South American transformations. I don't know if that's like truly legit or not. I hope Lula comes back to power, but he's not the be-all end-all. No, nor was Evo Morales when I was working in Bolivia, you know? But pushing can enact change. In the US, it's really difficult. I mean, it's really difficult. We thought we had a shot with Bernie. He was the most popular politician in the country, but there were a lot of reasons why we got taken out.
Okay, so I take that from that we need to make more connections. And I feel less afraid, thank you.
No, I appreciate that question. Thank you for that.
Last year in the Indian state of Telangana, the Electoral Commission organized the first online voting, the first in India. And essentially, as the drive for digitalization increases, more and more states are starting to use more ways of electronic political participation. So my main question would be, in your opinion, what are the, realistically speaking, the prospects for achieving transnational electronic democracy or electronic ways of political participation?
Yeah, I'm very skeptical of those things because, like, let's look at India, for example. I mean, this all comes out of the terrible biometric systems that were pushed out by neoliberals like Nandan Nilekani with Infosys, like over a decade ago, 15 years ago. You know, in India, as was said earlier, kind of invented the technology in a sense of fingerprinting. That's what people do and did in India. So when you try to get people to go into the electronic model, because we know that the vast majority of this is going to be governed by state meets corporate interests. India is extremely neoliberal and now neo-fascist with its treatment of Muslims. So it's a way to lock people into databases of trackability or systems of disciplining, right? So I think that, you know, here in the European Union, believe it or not, guys, I actually have, I'm kind of like psyched about the EU compared to where we are in the United States. I know there's a lot of problems in the EU, like it's, of course, Varoufakis has told me that. But like at the same time, you know, like at least you guys have some semblance of public governance checking power. This Digital Services Act is pretty good. It's better than the GDPR, which was done years ago. The Digital Markets Act I think that just went through, which was kind of a competitive framework. A model you all can look at is the utility-based model of regulation as well. So if this kind of, if an electoral democracy can be protected from predatory states and corporations, which sounds like a pipe dream, then so be it, right? But we know that most things digital are trapdoors to systems of power and disciplining. So I hope, I mean, if you guys can pull it off, like let me know, I'll be psyched about it, you know?
Thank you. My question concerns the role of education. For example, I read some time ago about an Indian farmer that never went to school, never had any like formal education, but he had access to the internet, and he was like watching Indian guys and not only Indian explain how to react to different situations in the farm, like irrigation methods and stuff like that. And he just watched all of that, and like when the reporters came, they were like, okay, this is the best farm around because the guy has access to some sort of education. There's also in Peru, well, in South America, there's like a role for the radio where like communities that are not connected sometimes get very practical advice as well. Yeah. So my question is, what role do you see for those kinds of knowledge networks of networks to transfer knowledge in building this sort of movement?
It's another great question. And it actually gets me at something that I was meaning to say, but I didn't quite say it clearly enough. What we're looking are for lateral and horizontal models of power, right? That's what we're looking at. And to think about production and transmission of knowledge in all its forms. We know knowledge is not simply digitally mediated, it's embodied, all these things I said earlier. But those sorts of models are collectivist models and they're lateral models, right? And James Carey, I don't know how many of you know the communications scholar James Carey, wrote a great piece many years ago where he contrasted, you probably know him, the ritual model of communication from what he called the transmission model of communication. And so lateral networks, which are not governed from in a hierarchical sense, because what companies like Google and Facebook did is they took advantage of a lateral framework where we each thought we were kind of doing our own thing, and they actually re-centralized it in a way that's sort of not so clear, but it's by sucking in all the data, right? The data is actually highly centralized where it goes to these server farms and so on, right? So I think that there's great amounts of power. And I know you mentioned radio there. I have seen in action like this thing that you're speaking about. I've seen how like the radio station is a mechanism for a kind of collective project of building and organizing and sharing and learning together. And that's kind of what, it's really amazing to think about radio in that sense, because it's cheap, it's low cost, it's oral, and it can be kind of moved around. It's nomadic in a sense. And so like, what if we think about technologies of, AI and everything else from that perspective? What do those things look like? And that's kind of a big part of what I want to think about. And I need your help, so.
Thank you.
Do we have more questions, or we're slowly?
Okay, so if no one wants to, I just would like for you to disambiguate one specific thing. You talked about correlation and semantics.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite grasp the idea, because I understand correlations as those big systems of correlating all data. And
right.
Like we can see in those models like DALL-E with generating images from correlations, statistical models. And why not semantics? I feel like semantics are still very strong, and well, we have discourses. So where is the distinction?
Yeah, so what I meant by that is, when I was at MIT, back in those days I was still kind of an engineer. And like when I was there, we were really trying to build semantic learning technologies. I was kind of studying AI at the MIT Media Lab at that time. And we really had trouble with building systems that can discern and grasp meaning. Like we found that to be a real issue with image recognition systems. And now this is like 15 years ago I was there, so we can keep that in mind. Not to mention that meaning is not singular, right? Like we should all remember that, right? It's ontologically distinct. So the point I'm getting at is the mechanism by which a lot of these things people think of as anthropomorphized or whatever, like human-like, are actually just built upon large data sets that are being scraped to look at, like, for example, with text, with like a language translation, like Google Translate, for example. It's just looking at large, what we call corpuses of data to look at the propinquity, proximity different algorithms to look at propinquity of language and reassemble translations based on that. So again, like what I'm saying is like there's the co-occurrence or co-relation of these objects, like what we call objects in computer sciences, that actually can be the basis that are fed into algorithms that are generative. So when we talk about deep machine learning or generative text algorithms or other kinds of algorithms of translation and authorship, usually they're based upon scraping and looking at patterns and generating based on patterns. So maybe pattern is the better word than correlation. But so if you can kind of have fast enough machines with enough data on them, and you just do n choose 2 and you develop a correlated score, you can then accordingly try to build some representation. And I just think that it's not as simple as that, of course. I don't know those algorithms. They're not telling us really what's going on. But I know that generally speaking, those are not based upon computers understanding the meaning of language per se. I mean, the real question is, what is meaning, right? On some level.
Yeah, well, meaning can be like on a biological level.
Yeah.
We could argue that it is also somehow pattern-based. So
sure,
it is a discussion for a conference.
It's the point of like the pattern, but what is interpreted from the pattern, huh? Like it's not merely the pattern, right? It's like the processing of the pattern. It's maybe not processing, the reflection of the pattern. I mean, it's all distinct points, but it's a good point. I mean, we are pattern recognizing animals as well as humans.
Just, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So as you know, in response to colonialism, countries got their independence, and one of the things they did is also nationalize the resources.
Yeah.
In some cases, like Chile, nationalize their communication industries.
Yeah, I was so happy about that.
So do you think the Global South should nationalize its data?
Which place?
The Global South, you know, countries.
Of course, yeah, totally. I mean, it's about exerting sovereignty over extraterritorial plunder, right? I mean, your talk said it all, right? I was taking tons of notes. It's really about, you know, the goal is not the state per se. I mean, it's whoever's going to protect locality and ways of being and knowing that humans have rights to. Right? So, you know, if when Evo like nationalized the mines, that was great news, but he was still cutting deals with the IMF, like you know that. So it's sort of like it's kind of like it's all like kind of headed toward a North Star, which is the recovery of power, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that we can close today's session. So thank you so much for the participation. I said to all the participants, to all the guests, to the audience, and I think that we had a lot of correlations, cross references, and we were diving in some specific topics. So I think I'm super happy after this day, and for me it was super interesting to be able to to think about all these super interesting concepts and to see these interrelations between them, because there are many. When we were speaking about border technologies, for instance, or borders, so we had so many perspectives to discuss it in relation to technology, for instance. So it's a super valuable day for me, and I hope also for you. And yeah, so thank you so much.